to this podcast, the Heidelminicast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
What about doing evangelism at an LGBTQ++ pride parade?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Allen Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
If you got the new Heidel app, it's available in the Google Play Store and in the Apple App Store. It will complete your life. All right, let's open up the coffer and pull out the letter here, which appears to be from Martin, spelled with a Y. Does that mean you're Welsh? I don't know. It just occurs to me. And Martin says, and given the domain, this might come from the UK. I don't know. I've never seen that domain, but I know where that river is. Anyway, it says, hello, Dr. Clark. I continue to enjoy listening to the show. Wondered what your thoughts were on doing gospel outreach at pride parades. Evangelists should be ready to preach the gospel to every creature, but if the message is being clearly rejected, does the New Testament give us guidance on what our response should be? I'm thinking about passages like Luke 9:5 and Acts 17:10. Is there a danger that we get more focused on asserting our First Amendment rights over the job description of the Great Commission? I don't want to use this as a cloak of cowardice where duty calls, but where does the warning of giving what is holy to dogs and throwing pearls before swine, Matthew 7:6, fit into all this, being shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves, Matthew 10:16. What are your thoughts? Well, that's an interesting question, and that's the question I want to deal with in today's episode.
The Heidelcast.
So the first passage that I thought about is the one that Martin mentioned at the end, but there are a couple of other things to think about here, I think. First thing I think we ought to think about is wisdom. And another thing we ought to think about is who is actually called to go out and to do evangelism. You know, it's widely assumed, I think particularly in America, because we had the social revolution in the early 19th century where we all became practically lowercase d Democrats, egalitarians. And the assumption came to be that anybody can do anything. Now, that's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's true enough to explain the shift that occurred in the early 19th century about who should do the work of the church. And so in our time particularly, there's been a lot of emphasis on every member evangelism. But the truth is, as far as I can tell from reading the New Testament, is that the case for every member evangelism is exceeding weak. There is very little evidence in the New Testament for lay evangelism. Now, I have tried to make the case for lay witness. I think there's a difference, evangelism being the official proclamation of the gospel by the Christ-confessing covenant community, the visible church established by Christ. That is the work of the ministers whom Christ has called and whom the church, by the authority of Christ, has ordained. I think all Christians should be ready to give witness, but you see very few instances in the New Testament of unordained people doing what we frequently call evangelism. In fact, I don't know of any. I do see examples of people giving witness. The man born blind, for example, in John 9 is one of my favorites, and there are a few others, but very few. But the idea that every member of the congregation is obligated to do the work of an evangelist, I think has virtually, and I say virtually just to cover myself in case I'm missing something, but there's no biblical support as far as I know for that notion. And yet people talk about it, and I was taught that idea as a young Christian, and people talk about it as if it were self-evident, as if every Bible-believing Christian knows this and believes this. You say, well, what about the Great Commission? Well, and to whom was the Great Commission given? It was given to the apostles. These are officers. And of course, when you're in a context, and I'm not saying this is true of Martin, But a lot of American evangelicals particularly, and maybe it's true of evangelicals elsewhere, are in a context where there is practically no doctrine of the visible institutional church. And the technical way of putting that is to say they have no ecclesiology, no doctrine of the visible church. It doesn't factor into their thinking. And so when they see Jesus saying something to the apostles about what the church should be doing in and through her officers, Americans just assume, well, that's for me. I'm one of those. Well, actually, you're not. One of the big arguments I tried to make in the series, Feathers and All, heidelblog.net/feathers, is that, in fact, you and I are not apostles. We don't have apostolic authority. We don't have apostolic gifts. And there's a real discontinuity between us and the apostles. So that's something we need to factor into our thinking. The second thought comes to mind, and that is the category of wisdom. When is something wise and when is it foolish? This is a category, again, that is not widely appreciated among American evangelicals or American Christians broadly. We tend to go immediately to commands or sin, those sorts of categories, rather than is this wise or is this foolish? And wisdom is a big category in Scripture, but it's one that tends to get ignored. And so it's something about which we ought to give some thought to. And then the last thing that comes to me in this, and one of the passages that I thought about, one of the passages to which Martin referred, is Matthew 7. And I'm going to read from the New American Standard. I don't think it's the NASB 95. I think it's just the Old American Standard. And for no particular reason except when I looked up the passage, that's the version that came up. So I'm not taking a stand, making any points, but recently somebody asked, why don't more Reformed people use the NASB? And I didn't have a very good answer. So anyway, it says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way that you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Then the question comes, well, how does the last verse, verse 6, relate to what precedes? Well, I'm not sure I have a very good answer, but I'm going to give the sort of traditional understanding. Verse 6 says, Matthew 7, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you into pieces. Now, my pastor, Chris Gordon, did give an explanation, which I thought was interesting. I'm not sure I was completely convinced, but you should maybe give a listen to it. He's been recently preaching through the Sermon on the Mount, and you can find those sermons at escondidourc.org. Oh, maybe you'll be persuaded, and maybe he's right. I don't know yet. But the traditional understanding of Matthew 7:6 is more or less, as Martin takes it, that there are times when you give something that's holy to people, and there are times that you don't. Well, when would those times be? American evangelicals, by and large, don't seem to have any time when they wouldn't give something that's holy. Because, again, I don't think this passage much figures. And I'll tell you, the person who caused me to think about this passage this way, or at least rethink this passage, is Polycarp. And I'm thinking about the martyrdom of Polycarp. And I'm in chapter 9, reading from the nice edition. This is the third edition of the Apostolic Fathers, published by or edited by Michael Holmes and published by Baker. And this is the text we use in our patristics seminar. Chapter 9, Martyrdom of Polycarp, dating to about AD 150. But as Polycarp entered the stadium, there came a voice from heaven, "Be strong, Polycarp, and courageous." And no one saw the speaker, but those of our people who were present heard the voice. And then, as he was brought forward, there was a great uproar when they heard that Polycarp had been arrested. Therefore, when he was brought before him, the proconsul asked if he were Polycarp, and when he confessed that he was, the proconsul tried to persuade him to recant, saying, "Have respect for your age," and other such things as they are accustomed to say Swear by the genius of Caesar. Repent. Say, away with the atheists. So Polycarp solemnly looked at the whole crowd of lawless heathen who were in the stadium, motioned toward them with his hand, and then, groaning as he looked up to heaven, said, away with the atheists. But when the magistrate persisted and said, swear the oath, and I will release you, revile Christ, Polycarp replied, for 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king, who saved me? But as he continued to insist, saying, swear by the genius of Caesar, he answered, if you vainly suppose that I will swear by the genius of Caesar as you request and pretend not to know who I am, listen carefully. I am a Christian. Now, if you want to learn the doctrine of Christianity, name a day and give me a hearing. The proconsul said, persuade the people. This is in chapter 10. But Polycarp said, you I might have considered worthy of a reply, for we have been taught to pay proper respect to rulers and authorities appointed by God, as long as it does us no harm. But as for these, I do not think they are worthy that I should have to defend myself before them. So in chapters 9 and 10, the martyrdom of Polycarp. Anyway, when I first read that, I was quite struck by his attitude and his response. And I thought, assuming that understanding of Matthew 7:6, that there seemed to be some real wisdom there, some insight into the nature of what was going on, and a pretty good application of Matthew 7:6. So that's how I would think about a pride parade. It's not a serious gathering. This is not the Athenian Philosophical Society as in Acts 17. These are people indulging in the worst kind of sensuality and sexual immorality, gross sexual immorality, really reveling in it. And so it seems to me, as I see things, a pretty clear example of throwing pearls before swine. Do not give what is holy to dogs. It is really giving something holy to people who have no spiritual interest, people who have no genuine intellectual interest, and it doesn't seem like it is the wisest way or the most apt time to be giving witness to the faith.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
The Heidelcast.
So I'm not saying by these comments that we shouldn't be giving the gospel to sinners. We certainly should. And, if you have opportunity to give witness, I think you should do that. I think you should pray for your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and pray for opportunities to give witness. And if you have opportunity to, bring people under the preaching of the gospel where they can hear the official proclamation of the evangel, properly evangelism, right? Paul tells Timothy to do the work of an evangelist. Timothy's not just some guy. He's a minister. He's a pastor. He has an office. He's been ordained. He's been set apart to that task. So that's his function. But certainly you should be giving witness. Now, should you be going to places and events and preaching publicly if you're not ordained to that? I think probably not. But you should be taking the opportunities that the Lord gives you to give witness. And, if you have friends and coworkers, particularly, if you're praying for somebody and asking the Lord to give you an opportunity, and a coworker or a friend, a neighbor, loved one says to you, well, I notice something different about you. Or, I noticed you go to church every Lord's Day, in fact, twice every Sunday. I noticed that, when your relative died, you didn't grieve the way sometimes people do. Something, whatever it is that comes up, and you're given an opportunity. Why is that? What do you believe? Something like that. When you get an opportunity like that, you really need to seize that. And you can always do two things. You can give witness to the faith. And, the Apostles' Creed is there for you, 12 articles. You can recite the Apostles' Creed, summarize the Apostles' Creed, maybe better recite it, and you can give a witness to your faith. It doesn't have to be complicated, doesn't have to be technical. The faith is what we say in the Apostles' Creed, and you could hand them a copy of the Heidelberg Catechism or a Westminster Shorter Catechism, as you please, and then you can always give witness to your faith. I believe these things. I've put my trust in Jesus. God opened my eyes and I saw the greatness of my sin and misery. I heard the law, I read the law, I realized that I was in jeopardy before the Lord, and I cried out and asked the Lord to forgive my sins. Whatever is true of you, that's all you have to say. You don't have to have a dramatic story. You don't have to try to manipulate anyone. It doesn't have to be terribly exciting. It just has to be true. So you can always do that, but it ought to be appropriate, and it ought to be at a good time and place. And based on what I know about pride parades, I have serious doubts as to whether such an event is an appropriate time or place.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.